Now, 34, he built the temple Tur Kalam for Anu Inanna and Nana. Upon the command of Anu and Enlil, he destroyed the walls of Mari and Malkia. Okay, now that he conquered Mari and Malkia, he destroyed their walls. He restored the temple, Eme Tur Sag, the pride of the hero, and built the temple tower, the mighty abode of Zababa, and the Inanna, whose top is sky high. They always say this, whose top shall reach to heaven, Tower of Babel, remember. And thus he greatly increased the glamour of Zababa as well as of Inanna in a pious manner. 37, through the great power of Marduk, he overthrew the army of Turuku, Kakmu, of the country of Subartu. That's all in the hill country northeast of what is today called Kurdistan. He conquered Eshnunna, which a flood had destroyed. Well, he conquered it before. He had to reconquer it. With the mighty power which Anu and Enlil had given him, he defeated all his enemies as far as the country of Subartu, which means up into Iran. He made the temple Emeshlam, as high as a mountain. The goddess Tashmetum listens to his supplication after the year Tashmetum. Also he made a great wall at the embankment of the Tigris, high as a mountain, called its name Pir of Shamash, and built also the wall of Rapiku at the embankment of the Euphrates. 43, as to Sippar, the primeval city of the sun god Utu, he provided it with a wall made of piled up earth. All right, the 43 years of Hammurabi's reign, every one of them recorded, and we can see from this list how he played the role of diplomacy and war and succeeded in establishing his empire. I have the impression that he was stimulating economic growth. He was building and increasing the arable land, the agricultural potential of the country by building these canals, building the dikes and the levees which contained the flood of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. These were all public works that were basically beneficial. Of course, you know, the works of building up the temples, this is for the greater glory of the people, and it's to give them pride and a sense of being good to the gods who will be good to us. But some of this expenditure is expenditure. Other of it, expenditure, is to increase the economy. I get the impression from what he did and also from his letters that he was always trying to raise the economy of the country and basically tie all the other states into his empire. The other thing is that following this, we have to read the prelude to his code, because in the preamble to the code, he lists all of his conquests, and he lists all of the cities that he conquered and where he built temples to their gods and goddesses. So you can see he had a sense of empire, a sense of incorporating all of these. He lists 31 city-states that he incorporated into his empire. He was an absolute monarch. But you see, when we think of absolute monarchy, we have the state of mind of the Enlightenment of the 18th century, which is absolute monarchy is terrible. You have to overthrow it and establish democracy. But when you look back at absolute monarchy under certain conditions and in certain periods, it turns out, especially from the Hammurabi, who is a wonderful example because we have so many records, that absolute monarchy in his case was a benevolent monarchy. He was absolute ruler, but he displays a responsibility to the welfare of the people in several expressions. Number one, he speaks of the law shall now be written and always spoken in the common language, the language of the common people. No more of this, what would we say, no more Latin in the courts, okay? As he would say, no more Sumerian spoken in the courthouses. From now on, Babylonian, or what he says, in Lishan Salmat Kakadu, which is the expression he uses, in the language of the black-headed people, or the dark-headed people, or meaning the people who are of the lower classes. Their language shall become the official language of the courts. So you could say that's a popular expression of popular will. The other thing, in the code, you can see that he has the principle of noblesse oblige worked right into the code. In other words, the same thing done by a man of the noble class and a man of a lower class, if it's a crime, the nobleman has to pay a larger fine as a greater responsibility and greater punishment than a person of a lower class. So you have this attempt to, you could say, not equalize as much as ameliorate the differences in the classes. And also, there was no fixed caste but a person was in a certain class depending on his economic situation and the kind of land that he owned. So if he managed to become wealthy and buy land which had river frontage, kind of was elevated to the higher class because he had better land and also greater responsibility. And from the code we can see how much responsibility is imposed on each person depending on the kind of land that he owns. If he owned land alongside, on the banks of the river, he was responsible for flood control, he was responsible for irrigation of the main canal. So you have all of these elements in it which reflect also Hammurabi's feeling. He was the 6th king of a dynasty. So in effect he felt these were his people. I mean, he was not a ruler who was trying to rob his people for himself. He tried to improve the status of the whole country for his greater glory, but also for the benefit of the people. And he probably had this the concept that don't destroy the lower classes because then you'll collapse right on top of them.
So he never used slave labor?
I don't think he used slave labor as slave labor. In other words, people were employed and people have the status of slave. There is a status of noble, freeman, slave. These are 3 statuses of society. We have tablets, I'll describe some of them, where slaves sue their masters and bring them to court and get a judgment against them. So that's the different type of slavery that you could say.
So what is it? The slaves were chattel at that point?
No. Slaves were never chattel until the 19th century. In world history, slaves were never chattel until modern times. I mean, the idea of a, pardon?
They were bound to their...
They were bound to their masters, but they had rights. They could speak up. I mean, the masters bought them. You could buy a slave, and the Torah even describes purchasing a slave or a man going into slavery in order to pay off his debts. I mean, these things are there. But every slave had rights, and real rights, and was recognized as a human being. The slavery of the 18th, when did it begin? It begins in the 18th century and the 19th century of British colonies and the Americans and South Africa. This did not exist in antiquity. That's amazing. That's a modern problem, where a slave was bought like a goat or a horse, and you could buy him and sell him and do anything you want with him.
This is more like indentured service.
Exactly. Absolutely, yes. And when slaves were employed, they were not employed as slaves. I mean, they were paid. They were employed. What the Torah says, when you have a slave, meaning it seemed to be an indentured person who has to pay off his debts because there were no laws of bankruptcy, it says you have to pay him for the work that he did in addition to the fact that he gets free room and board and pays off his debt. You also have to pay him. Yes, they had to pay them, maintain them, and also maintain a certain standard of living. They had to provide them a standard of living. It's quite clear from these cases. As I said, once you see a slave suing her mistress in court and gaining a judgment against her, then you realize this was an entirely different system. Although she was called a slave, she was purchased. We actually have the tablet of her sale. Her mother sold her into slavery. And then later on, this same young woman sues her mistress. It's an entirely different system. So the year list of Hammurabi gives us a very interesting insight into Hammurabi's method of diplomacy and war.